Hello, welcome to the
Won't you lend your lungs to me?
Podcast.
Mine are collapsing. Plant my feet and bitterly breathe up the time that's passed. Breath I'll take and breath I'll give. Pray the day's not poised. Stand among the ones that live in lonely indecision.
Welcome to Crackpot Podcast, episode 43. It's July 24th, and it's morning for both myself and for James this time. Good morning, James.
Good morning, Lynn. I'm on the top of the world in the Rocky Mountains.
How nice.
That's right. I feel like Moses on Mount Sinai.
Keep your shoes off. So you're at home base there with Ishmael.
Yes. I've based books and I've shipped off my library to different locations where I have friends in these disintegrating states of America so that I can finish certain books in certain areas of the country. So I pretty much ship books to people that I thought that those people would read, that they like that subject. So then I'll finish a book on that subject when I get there, because with my history books, I really do still rely on print books for sources, especially when I'm finishing a book. And I'm going to be hopefully finishing some novels, starting a World War II biography of a Utah man who was decorated for his combat operations in the very same theater that the petty officer Keoma fought. And I will hopefully be wrapping up one of the Plantation America books. I think it'll be Cracker Boy. I brought work to finish most of American Spartacus, but I think I'm going to get that finished before I head back east. I'll probably finish that in the east. So that's what's up with the
With your 30-odd in progress books. That number never seems to go down.
Yeah, and I'm actually I haven't added some of these other projects to the list.
Yeah.
It's embarrassing, and I don't want it to go up over 30.
Well, it's embarrassing for me because I have about a dozen that I need to edit and publish. But we did manage to publish Supplicant Song about a week ago. So that was good.
And we sold a copy, right?
Yeah, sold a copy.
Oh, well, that's great. That's great. Let's dedicate the podcast to that.
To that reader.
That generous reader who actually purchased my tribe's yards.
Yeah.
There'll be many more of them to come.
They're good. They're pretty short. This one is pretty short, probably a couple, 2-3 hours of reading. I don't know how fast people read. But it's a story of a city that's just really kind of creepy and made out of bones, I think, for the most part. Is that right?
Yes, it's actually a necropolis, kind of like a hive necropolis that starts with, in the prehistory of this place, when the Ice Age just started, it just started with these seers that were keeping track of the progress of the ice at the edge of the world, living in huts made of their predecessors' bones. And then it really became a pilgrimage place for, go figure, white people who've stopped breeding and are waxing suicidal and want to do all kinds of drugs and find some kind of salvation that they have no hand in. So they travel to the edge of the world to be attended by the various functionaries of the City of the Dead. Yuglasag, I think is what I called it, which is an old name from this. I made up this group of subhuman guys that have tusks, and they play a game called Speed Skull with enemy heads, and so I gave them a properly guttural language that I think has about 100 words in it.
But they're also animal inhabitants that also play a role in this society. and then a visitor, a strange visitor as
Now,
well.
what did you think of the animal inhabitants? There were.
I liked how you did it. I don't want to give too much away, but the main characters or the main categories are rats and ravens. There may even be some with the ravens or some kind of cult of people that imitate the ravens and have their own apparatus that makes them look like a raven, stuff like that. So I liked it. I liked it because it's believable, because in a way of what animals really do have been observed to do, and but sort of a little bit more sophisticated and then involved in this kind of religious cult. So it's pretty cool.
I actually developed this setting in 1988 is when I actually worked out this version of Earth, which is what it is. There's a large map I made, and I set it 280 million years in the future at the point where Africa should be almost split, and you would have this really long sea along the fault line that goes up through Tanzania and Kenya all the way up to the Red Sea, to around, I think, Djibouti and Eritrea. That's how far in the future it is. So it's really a setting where the people abandoned the planet, but then were brought back in the future and had to resettle it. And
Okay.
then, I just can't help writing about Ice Age settings. So, there's an Ice Age.
I prefer Ice Age settings too. Well, Reverend Chandler was the book that got me hooked, so that's an Ice Age book too.
The first one I did was Beyond the Ember Star, which was about time travelers trying to retrieve extinct strains of humanity from the past, and going back and trying to kidnap a couple of Neanderthals, at least a child. And the idea was somewhat based on Isaac Asimov's The Ugly Little Boy, which Silverberg ended up doing a posthumous collaboration with him. It was a really good story, but it had a lot of gay, sentimental elements and just this inability to see things from outside of a laboratory or library setting. This is written by people with kind of no idea of physicality. And I think if you're going to properly deal with a race of human beings that basically lived off of giant bulls that they killed with hand spears and hand axes, that they didn't shoot, that they actually waded into a stream bed and fought with these, 5,000-pound bulls just to make their living. According to there's some way of tracking elements in the bones of ancient people that whoever study this can determine through an analysis of the elements in the bones what they ate and what percentage of animal they ate. So I think 52% of the Neanderthal diet in Europe was auric, which is basically a giant version of the rodeo bull. And these people didn't have any missile weapons. Anything they killed, they had to kill with their hands. So I really thought that a scientist and an English geek, weren't the guys to properly do it. I thought I was a better qualified Neanderthal interpreter than Asimov and Silverberg.
I would agree with that. And this is what Taleb calls skin in the game, and I haven't forced you to read any Taleb lately because I don't know, I'm not reading as much myself, but skin in the game, this is not, you can't write about these things like combat like you write about if you've never done it. It's much different. So also I got curious about this, and there are people who leap bulls, and it's part of certain like rodeo shows where these guys, have you seen those videos? They stand in front of the bull and just make a big jump as the bull approaches.
No, I haven't seen that. I've only seen men that they call the bullfighters that rescue the rodeo cowboys on the PBR circuit. And they're in charge of distracting the bulls. But the ancient Cretan pottery from the Minoan civilization from 5,700 years ago had young men and young women in ceremonial attire leaping bulls. And it was somehow part of the boxing ritual. And the boxers were fighting with leather hand straps. And in later Greek times, the law was that these leather hand straps had to be made of bull's hide. So there's some kind of connection between ancient boxing and the bull. It got split at some point in the past, I guess in Roman times. In Roman times, you still had, in the Greek times, you would have, the bull was what you got your wraps from, and they didn't really have this rodeo fighting the Greeks did. The Romans brought that back. But the Greeks always had this attachment to the bull as the animal that was sacrificed before the boxing ritual, and the hands were wrapped in its hide. The attachment with animals in the Supplicant Song really came, I got the idea from Orson Scott Card, who wrote a series of books called Harmony. He's actually, I think he was a Mormon, or is a Mormon, from Utah. He's really a brilliant writer. He wrote a lot. I read about a dozen of his short stories about 30 years ago. But he had this series of large novels titled Harmony. I think it might have been 2 trilogies. And people that have settled a planet in another solar system eventually decide to make a pilgrimage back to Earth, and they find out that there's a war going on between the inheritors, which are raccoons and rats. You have raccoons and rats competing actually for the alliance of mankind when mankind comes back. And I think one of these species of animals kind of worships, the man like as returning God. So that was in the back of my mind when I got the idea for this.
I like it because it really has to be urban animals. These raccoons, rats, and crows are good too, because they are almost domesticated. They're not exactly domesticated, but they're interdependent with human settlement, so that makes a lot of sense that they would develop that way.
I've hardly seen any rats since I've left the Baltimore area, and I have hardly seen any crows.
Oh, I have crows, a lot of crows here in my neighborhood.
Well, I was with Sea Daddy, and I noted that I hadn't seen a crow in a couple of weeks, and he said, "Well, you haven't seen a black person, have you?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, I always told my children that that's what happened when black people died. They became crows. That's kind of like their spirits. They fly around." And he said, "I still feel guilty sometimes about telling them that." So I was a little. So I guess when ghost people die, we come back as seagulls.
Or pigeons.
Feed over the trash pile. But that's really odd, because in Colorado and in Utah, I've seen plenty of seagulls.
Oh, really?
And hardly any crows. And
yeah,
of course, I'm seeing mostly ghost people. So I think maybe this idea of transmigration into avian form, it's at least plausible on the surface.
Oh yeah, I think so. And it's very plausible that the rats in Baltimore are doing all kinds of crazy things that you when you're not looking at them.
But my favorite science fiction fantasy writer is Gene Wolfe. Okay, I think both names end with an E. And he wrote the Book of the New Sun, which was 4 novels. In that, there was a scene where Severian, who was the orphan who was adopted by the Guild of the Torturers, has to go inquire at the library of the master of the library. And there's a long discussion of books and books as artifacts in this. With Wolfe, you get all kinds of really pleasing digressions. And Severian notes offhandedly that the rats in the library are using their feces to actually write on the covers of the books and on the shelving in their own crude script. They're beginning to imitate humans. And now this is a novel that's set so far in the future. I think it's over 1 billion years in the future, because the sun is getting weak and humanity is going to end up having to leave the solar system. So it's that far in the future. It's another inspiration for my use of animals and Supplicant Song. So it's, it was a geek out for me. I hope the reader enjoys it.
Well, at least I read it also, and your other proofreader, Colin, read it as well. So there's a few of us out here.
Okay, well,
who
cool. That's
enjoyed
worth
it.
it. If I got one person who reads it before I croak, then I think I'm happy.
Next up is Thunderbird. That is, I'm probably going to send it to Tony today, and Tony will do one last proofread of it. I'm sure he'll find some errors on my part. But Thunderbird is the story of Thunderbird plus a few other short stories. And going back to the Neanderthal thing, I like the way you described the Indians being really quite physically different from the current residents of Baltimore, because they really were. I think these guys are Eastern Indians, but I know the Plains Indians were really big and healthy because they ate a lot of buffalo.
Yeah, and I think it was the 1860s when this study was done. Anthropology was really kicking off around about the middle of the 19th century, and ghost people of conscience were realizing that these many interesting forms of human life were going to become extinct at the rate at which European people were overrunning formerly, uncultivated areas. And the three largest groups of people in the world in the mid-1800s, according to whoever these British geeks were who were running around, they were also measuring penises, by the way. Okay, I mean, it was...
You have to measure everything.
Right, okay. So
it's not complete if you...
According to them, the three largest groups of people were the Polynesians, the American Plains Indians, and the Zulus. You had an average height that was approaching 6 feet tall with these people. And there's this idea that people have always been tiny, that a lot of people get from going to museums and everything. And it's really ridiculous. The really small stature people, you only find them in low protein agrarian settings. The most form of human life is the poor person who has a high work rate and a low protein diet.
Yeah, leaving aside genuine pygmies, which also exist. But yeah, and when you see civilization, agriculture take hold, you see people shrink. And then, of course, now we're all quite well fed and huge, but it's different. The Plains Indians particularly just had really outstanding diet. They had as much buffalo as they could eat, and that makes big, healthy people.
Well, in Mesopotamia, you had women were under 5 feet tall in ancient Mesopotamia and had terrible arthritis in their knees from grinding grain from about age 30. These people were not living any longer than Neanderthals had been living. And because you also they're living in close proximity to domesticated animals where most of our diseases come from.
Right.
That we have rampant in the population. So, and the other batch of diseases come from when you finally invade the tropics and then spread mosquitoes all over the world so that you can die of yellow fever no matter what hemisphere they're in. But the Indians in Thunderbird were what Increase Mather would have called the Mohogs, okay, or Mohawks, which means either wolf or man-eater, okay, depending on how you look at it. And I of course, chose the latter, man-eaters. These Eastern Woodland Indians, all the illustrations from 1585 on show them being taller and broader and far more healthy than the Europeans that they met, and wearing far less clothes, even in relatively northern climates. They had a high activity rate, and they also painted themselves a lot. So they would use paints actually to
sunscreen,
and even for warmth. In Virginia, they would just paint their whole body in the wintertime and go out in the snow and go hunt.
Wow.
Most naked, which John Smith thought that was kind of crazy. And again, even in the illustrations that were commissioned by John Smith, he's shown as a midget compared to the Indians that he's dealing with.
Right.
And it was, it was essentially true. But Thunderbird is set in 1676, which is at the end of the two wars that went concurrently in New England, that was King Philip's rebellion against the Puritans and the other Indians, in which the Indians were outnumbered by the Indians who were allied with the Puritans. And the Mohawks were the ones that struck the decisive blow against King Philip. And Increase Mather said, smote them in their home to their great woes, something like that. And the war was still raging in Virginia after King Philip got his head lopped off. So I decided that since there were already Iroquois warriors operating as far south as North Carolina against Virginians, I decided that I would have one band of the Mohawks decide not to go back to the villages and towns, which were essentially ruled by the women. Okay, so they decided to stay on the warpath rather than go back and try to get permission to go out on the warpath again. And so it was a little, I had them rebelling a little bit against the Mother Earth half of the Iroquois society. But the interesting thing I found when I was at the Indian Steps Museum with Nero the Pick up in Lancaster County, PA, was a chart of Susquehannock expansion. The Susquehannock Indians are illustrated to look very similar to the Iroquois, and they were Iroquois, and the Delaware, who were Algonquin. And they lived in the same area. The Delaware are the ones that William Penn made his deal with. The Susquehannock, they ended up dealing with the English down in Maryland. That's an English name. That's not an indigenous Indian name for the tribe, Susquehannock. Neither is Conestoga. In the last phase of the life of this tribe, they were called the Conestoga, and they were already mixed with other tribes. Well, when you look at the population level of these Indians, according to the extensive archaeology on the Susquehanna River, which has been dug up and dammed a lot and quarried, in 1525, that's 1 year after Di Verrazzano, the Italian who was navigating and charting the Atlantic coast of America for the French monarch, a year after he contacts native people all along the East Coast, the Susquehannocks start using iron, and their population starts to expand, and they start building larger settlements. And from 1525 until 1671, their population doubles every 30 years, sometimes in as little time as 25 years. So this is in the wake of them being exposed to the epidemic diseases that wiped out millions of American Indians and other parts of the two continents in the Western Hemisphere. And then 70 years later, when you see White's first illustrations of what these people look like, they look like skinheads. They look like English or Australian skinheads. So since you've had Basque fishermen from all these nations, and explorers and traders and whalers up and down this coast for 100 years, Basques were there even before Columbus, fishing on the Grand Banks. And then when you look into the fact that most of these sailors on these ships have been cleaned out of prisons, or they've been beaten up in a bar or tavern and dragged on board, and the fact that these ships have to put in to trade and take on water and scrape the barnacles off their hulls, and then you read literature from 100 years later and from the period, for instance, Magellan's voyage, where as soon as the ship pulls in, the sailors are climbing over the sides like ants and swimming for their life to get to the hills. Now, if they go directly to the villagers on the coast who have trading agreements with the sea captains, they just give them right back to the sea captains, which happened to the guys on the Bounty who decided to stay on Tahiti instead of going with Fletcher Christian to Pitcairn Island. So what you ended up with, whatever these English, Basque, French, Spanish guys, any of these guys that could make it past the coastal tribes would go inland and meet up with the interior tribes who were enemies of the coastal tribes. And that's really the only explanation you can get for the Caucasian appearance of these people 100 years later, and also the fact that their population is expanding, even as the natives on the coast, by the time the Pilgrims land, they're decimated in the coastal areas, yet the mountain populations are booming. And you saw the same thing happen on the West Coast in the early 1800s.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I've read 2 books on it, and there's also a primary source out there. A guy writes his story of running away to live with the Indians in what is now Seattle and Washington. Actually, these were guys that were on the expedition that founded Seattle, and 7 of them jumped ship and went to live with the Indians. This one guy survived. So the guys I write about in Thunderbird, they're essentially it's a 100% Native American culture, but racially they're probably about 40 to 50% Caucasian at that time.
Okay. That's already a pretty good admixture.
Right.
We're learning now that populations can change really substantially in 500 or 1,000 years, especially when the birth rate is high. So even, accounting for the absorption of runaways and whites and stuff, if there's a good birth rate, even more change can take place. So this is really a dynamic population when you're talking about the Native Americans in that period.
Right. For instance, the Susquehannocks, they traded furs to Lord Calvert, governor of Maryland, in return for English slaves. And, that was population replacement.
All right.
I found an account of this one poor guy who gets captured. He was fighting with Rogers Rangers. He gets captured in, I think, the 1750s, and he's sold by one tribe of Indians to this other tribe who assigned him to be like the husband of some old widow out in the middle of nowhere, and he's got to go hunt for her. So he eventually got out of it and wrote his own pamphlet. I will hopefully one day get a hold of that pamphlet and do an annotated version of that. And that I will not finish the 13th tribe, which is going to be a treatment of the slavery dynamics in New England and how it was founded. And the slavery dynamics in England had a whole lot to do with enslavement of English by Indians and Indians by English, which is not something that anybody's used to looking at.
No, you get this very simple story, and that's never never the truth, right? It's very much more complicated. So it's so interesting that you're bringing it out. But I think what people really want to know about Thunderbird is the fact that this band of Native American warriors time travels to present-day Baltimore, and
This was not my idea. Ishmael wrote me in during the riots. He said, I want to know what would happen if you could take 100 Blackfeet warriors and drop them in Baltimore. What that would be like. Based on his observation that the entire Baltimore City Police Department was defeated by 60 kids throwing stones. I had done no research on the Blackfeet Indians, okay? But I had done a ton of research on the Iroquois and the Algonquin people, the Eastern Woodwind Indians, for the Sunset Saga. I've got 10 novels in the bag on that subject, and that's all I read about for about a year. In 2009, when I was researching that. So I decided it would be the Mohawks that would do it, and it would be enough guys that they could fit on a Chinook. And I decided that the Chinook would be the time travel device. In case any physicists were reading this, I decided to depict the time travel from the point of view of the not very scientific-minded Native American warriors.
I've learned that's how you deal with these complicated things. You don't try to make some goofy explanation. You just, hey, they got in the Chinook. When they got out, they were in present-day Baltimore. Okay?
Right.
That's the story.
Yeah, I don't need Ben Bova cutting my balls off for, breaking some rule of quantum physics. So he could illustrate the realistic time travel, and I can, illustrate the realistic human behavior. Okay, so that's why I looked at it. There's a place where various reparations recovery agents have tried to relieve me of my ill-gotten goods, all the wealth housed within my 35-year-old jacket with the rotted lining, where there's the 8th U.S. Marine Reserve Engineer Battalion. So I decided that a couple of Lumbee Indians, they're basically like Puerto Ricans.
Okay, so this is funny too, because we talked about Lumbees with John Paul Barber, but you have these war bands. It's really two different war bands are working together. Those are Native Americans, as we already talked about. But then they also have these helpers because they need help driving cars and stuff. So they get these Lumbee helpers who are present day totally insane people, and then there's even a bonus insane present day person who joins the fun. So it's pretty funny.
Yeah, I put a real live Harm City character in the story. Okay. Well, what I decided is they would need some kind of guides, and of course the time machine is coming from the future in the form of the Chinook, which they think looks like a flying salmon. Okay.
That's an aside. Is that so much of our military equipment has Native American names.
Oh, the Apache.
Yeah.
Right. So
Tomahawk missiles.
There's a modern day Iroquois warrior who's basically, a Native American activist. Okay, like the Warrior International guide, it sends me like 5, pipeline news items a day. And
I didn't know you had a friend like that.
Yeah, well, I don't think I don't think he considers me a friend, but I consider him a friend. I'm an unrepentant paleface. So I have this guy recruit some Lumbee Indians, okay, to basically man the equipment that's going to pick up these warriors from the past and then serve as their guides in the destruction of Baltimore. And their mission is pretty basic. It's to annihilate all the white men, all the soot white men, and to rape all the white women. Okay, so this
is content. This book has adult content.
This is it. This is basically the mission, and I think it's 104 pages. That novella, the whole thing comes in over 200 pages because of the other stories in it, like animal control. But we're at 237 pages at the current edit. Thunderbird itself is like 110 pages, and I think 98 of it was just slaughter and pillage. Okay.
Yes, so, it's on pretty much every page. So if you are averse to that, it's not the book for you. But yes, on every page there is raping and pillaging.
All right, and also in this book is the novelette Animal Control.
Animal Control is very good also. Yeah.
It's about animals trying to take over Baltimore.
Similar to our talking Supplicant Song.
Right. Animals become sentient, kind of like the Frosty the Snowman hat thing. I think this is the one where Cooter Boone, the redneck, is driving with his John Deere hat, and he actually runs over LL Coon J, the oppressed rapper.
That's right.
And his fitted hat lands on a raccoon's head, and the John Deere hat lands on this buck's head. And then the deer and the raccoon get together and figure out how to use Cooter Boone's gun. Okay.
Yes.
I consulted with real hunting men. Okay. To work this out. I wrote that in a day, by the way.
Yeah.
I wrote it in one psychotic day. It was a pretty weird experience writing that.
Yeah, and I'm not going to spoil the ending, but I really like the ending. There's a special appearance by someone we all know and love. But you're going to have to read it. And it also has a few... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, we got the filthy few stuff in there that I've done so far to set up the collaboration with Samuel Finlay.
I wanted to say it has some guest items from Riley and from Tony Cox, as well as a couple of your vignettes, and The Negotiator, which you was inspired by Joe Bellafato as well.
I couldn't come up with a story idea that good, so I just tried to do the execution for him and not make it too violent. Joe's not a violent guy. Joe's a man of the mind, so...
It's not a violent story, but it's one that makes you think. And Joe Bellafato, for those who don't know, is an artist, and he's done a lot of artwork for you, right? And his own artwork as well.
Oh, he did all the Broken Dance stuff for the boxing books. And he's been doing very well for himself, doing commission pieces and prints. I mean, he's booked up. You really wouldn't be able to get him to do anything right now because he's got so much work to do. He's a full-time artist. He's got a He's got a studio set up in a very nice location outside of Hindustan. We both formerly worked as grocers in Hindustan. Okay, so he's out in the country there somewhere making beautiful artwork. He sends me things every once in a while that he's done, and it's really phenomenal. He did the cover of Taboo U. That was an old 1996, I think, Samson and Delilah painting that he did, the cover of Taboo U.
We have to talk about Samson and Delilah someday. That was on my old to-do list with you. Then you started to talk about The Filthy Few, which is one of my favorites that you have in progress. And a couple of those pieces are in here as well as kind of previews.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really original. It's an extra dirty half dozen. Okay, so it's basically inspired by the Dirty Dozen movie, and it's about, and we're going to have to finish it before the upcoming 2020, because it's really about a man that comes back from service, and he's recruited by an agent of the God Emperor Trump to deal with some out-of-control intelligence agency thugs that are threatening U.S. citizens. To do this, he's armed for the 6 nastiest murders.
What do you want? There is no more. If you find a place, please let me know. Take me with you when you go. Take me with you when you go. Take me with you when you go.